Go ahead.
Today is July 1st, 2022. My name is Jason Higgins. I'm a historian at Virginia Tech. And then joining me today for an oral history interview over Zoom is Mike Wittels, a Vietnam era veteran who was imprisoned in a military brig for opposition to the Vietnam War as a conscientious objector. Also joining me today is Gabrielle Wells,
Hi, Gabrielle.
my research assistant for this summer, who was also in my Vietnam War history class last semester. This interview is part of the Incarcerated Veterans Oral History Project. And before we get started, Mike, I wanted to ask, do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes. Yes.
Great. And last time we left off, you had narrated your experiences in Fort Knox military brig. And we were in the process of talking about about what happened after you got out of the brig and how you ultimately were discharged from the military. Is there anything that you wanted to go back to from the first half of the interview? And if not, feel free to take it up at that point.
Well, Jason, I sent you those notes, and they were essentially answers to the questions that you've asked. Real quick, Gabriel asked what had gotten me through, and I wanted to make clear that being locked up in a stockade is different from being locked up in a prison. Most of the people there, in fact, everyone except me, got out pretty quickly. That is to say, in a month or two, and they were sent back to duty, or they were discharged as unsuitable. That was a psychologist's assessment, or undesirable, which is a slightly lower class discharge, meaning we just don't want you, but not dishonorable. You can only get a dishonorable discharge through the result of a general court-martial and several reviews. So I had said it was my girlfriend that kept me going, and it would be more accurate to say my romantic idea of my girlfriend, or my romantic idea of a prisoner pining for his true love kind of thing. But the fact was, as I wrote to Jason, I never knew what would happen from 1 minute to next. So it was plenty to keep me busy. But what really kept me going is I both thought I would get beat up or killed and get out in a minute, get out the next morning. Partly because I had gone to see counselors who said the Army policy had been for a few years to let out non-cooperators with an undesirable or unsuitable discharge. But it looked like, the counselor said, they were changing that policy. And so I was right in the middle. Also, I had people outside writing to their Congress people and so on. And I thought that would work. It didn't. I wrote that Jason, I had very unusual childhood in a way, in that my dad used to take me on his reporting assignments. So I met all kinds of people that kids didn't usually meet. We lived. Growing up, I thought everybody was either Catholic or Jewish, because all my neighbors were, and all my schoolmates were, except for a handful of African Americans. It turned out that was because there were what were called covenants, legal things that house owners couldn't sell to Catholics or Jews. Or I think they called them Negroes with the capital N, which was irrelevant in the case of where I lived, because African Americans didn't make enough money through de facto and actual discrimination to live there. They lived in a little village, a little compound right across city line called Lamont, after Lucretia Lamont, and it had been a station on the Underground Railway. And we learned about that in grammar school. We learned about, well, you know, a sanitized version of slavery and the Underground Railway. And I'd also mentioned in my notes that my dad was anti-racist. He wasn't an activist. He didn't make a big deal of it. But my sister and I, had the understanding that these were people too. In the neighborhood and the school, there was, I'll use the word benign, but it doesn't mean nice. It means kind of attitude towards African Americans, like, well, if they get more education, they'll be just like us. So it wasn't hostile. When I went in the Army, I was quite surprised. I told last time the story of the chaplain that told us that you have to be tolerant. They're happy people who like to sing and dance. I watch them at my window. I mentioned a couple of racist incidents. We only had one African American in basic training, and nobody hassled him. I think we didn't have time to. I mean, the people who might have didn't have time to. We just kept busy with Army stuff. I told the story of, in AIT, Advanced Individual Training, to become a heavy weapons infantry, and that was very, very rugged. I was walking back from dinner to the barracks one day, and a fat sergeant came up to me and said, "Hey, how much to kill that nigger?" And without missing a beat, I said, "Same as for a white man." I don't know how I had the presence to just say that. And he never hassled me again. He just said, "Oh," and went away. I told the story of when my buddy Taggart and I went to Leesville, the nearby town, at near Fort Polk. We wanted to go to a movie, and we paid, and the sign said, "Colored upstairs only." And that really set off my northern sensibilities. And I said, "Come on, Tag, we're going up there." But he wouldn't do it. So we walked around town. I think that's all the catching up I needed to do. So to get back to the discharge, again, I had no idea what would happen to me the minute I got discharged. You know, we entertain all kinds of fantasies, and it's like a multiple choice of things. So I thought, oh, they'll hand me my discharge and I'll be free to go. What happened is I was taken to a new company commander who and I mentioned this, gave me the same orders. And I was rearrested within 20 minutes and made a maximum security prisoner. Maxes have double white armbands. I had a single one before. I was put in a cell with escape risks. That's why they were maximum security. 24 hours before that, I had been allowed to wander in the woods, and my behavior hadn't changed, but now I was max security. Probably harassment, probably more of this psychological warfare. And I couldn't go out on my own or anything. Always had to have guards. I was taken to the legal section to talk to an Army lawyer, and the Army lawyer who had been my defense counsel for my special court-martial. By the way, the maximum sentence on a special, it was 6 months. So that's what I got. And he said, you know, they've transferred me to prosecution, so I can't help you this time. But I'd like to see you. He was interested. He wasn't sympathetic to my position, but he was interested because I wasn't one of the regular prisoners who were just AWOL and there's not much that an attorney could do for them, or turned out for me. So he asked if I would take an unsuitable or undesirable discharge as a plea bargain. And I said, sure, whatever. I've had all the fun I can stand. And so there were there were one or two more trips to JAG, legal headquarters, and they would put me in a cage when they weren't talking to me. Anyway, I was called back again, and called back means I'd be put in a truck between two guards. It wasn't nothing casual about it. And this time, Lieutenant Goldstein said, well, the commanding general heard of a CO in Fort Sill who just got 5 years, and he wants that to happen to you. So now I was facing 5 years in Leavenworth. Leavenworth is more like a prison. So I thought, oh, always happy and right. Well, I could learn welding there. But he had contacted my counselor in Philadelphia, a guy named Arlo Tatum, a wonderful guy who had actually been the counselor for Muhammad Ali and Arlo Guthrie. And between that and the Army lawyer counsel, contacted the ACLU, and they sent an ex-Marine, JAG, who was, again, he was all for the Vietnam War, but he believed in civil liberties. So a few days later, I was put in a truck between two armed guards. And I knew that before I could get a general court-martial, I would have to have a hearing called an Article 32. So I'm in this truck, squashed between two guards. I have my white armbands on, of course. They don't know me. To them, I'm a serious escape risk. And out of principle and personality, I wouldn't try. Also, I was too scared to escape. Anyway, they're driving and driving and driving. It seemed like quite a long ways. And in the distance, I hear gunshots. Bang, bang, bang. And we're getting closer and closer to the gunshots. Several minutes before, I had asked them to loosen my handcuffs a little bit. As a matter of principle and personality, I don't like to complain, but these were really tight. And they wouldn't do it. They were afraid I would escape. But we're getting closer and closer to the gunshots. And I said, where are we going? They said, to your court-martial. And I thought, no, I have to get the hearing first. So maybe this was psychological warfare again, but as with a lot of my incarceration, I just didn't know what would happen next. And I thought, not a good way to die, but what can I, Anyway, after a while, they passed a little building and the driver got out, went into the building, came back, didn't say a word, started driving again. And we got to a somewhat larger building with about 5 cars parked in front of it. The guards took me in, and there was my ACLU lawyer who had come to the stockade at one point. I met him, and he told the guards, take his handcuffs off. And then he turned to me, he said, you know, you were so late that they were ready to call in escaped prisoner. So had that happened, I might have gotten the shots. Oh, by the way, I found out later we were just getting near the shooting range, and that's why I heard the shots. So the young lawyer took command of the situation and said, we need to talk. I need to talk to my client alone. There was also an Army lawyer there, and who didn't say much. He was just along for the ride. We went into a little room. The lawyer went over the case. We went into a hearing room. There was a hearing officer in front, a guy who looked like he would be happier on the battlefield, and he kept saying, tits on a bull, tits on a bull. And he clearly didn't approve of any of this. I should just be locked up and the key was thrown away. But that was his assignment, to be the hearing officer. There were about half a dozen other officers and maybe enlisted personnel sitting in chairs. My brand new company commander, who had given me these orders, was called in to testify. And he testified that he had given the orders, that I had said no, that I didn't want to, anyway. And then the first sergeant was called in, and the first sergeant was the one who came to the stockade to pick me up, which I thought was unusual, and which the attorney found through testimony had never been done before in this first sergeant's 23 years. It turned out that the confinement officer, Captain Min, had told this commanding officer, when he called him in to his office the last day of my sentence, that I was dangerous and that I should be locked up right away again and not allowed to talk to other prisoners and so on. Anyway, in the examination of this commanding officer, the attorney, I remember his name now, Mr. Post, said, so you told Wittels to put on his uniform and report to building 2327 at 0700 the next morning. Yes, sir, I did. When I was leaving the stockade that morning, they ripped off my armband because I was no longer a prisoner. I was then wearing a fatigue shirt and pants with no insignia. So the lawyer said, well, what was Wittels wearing? Well, he was wearing his fatigue uniform. So I had a uniform on. And when was he supposed to report to building 2323? 0730, that's the next morning, that's 7:30. I know what that is, the Marine officer said. So how could he report to that building when he was in the stockade? So they had to dismiss the charges. But that didn't get me discharged. That simply meant I would be put back to active duty for training. The lawyer had contacted my counselor, Arlo, who I'm pausing to shorten this. A couple of months before, Arlo, who was no longer allowed to correspond with me, the confinement officer would no longer allow his letters through, had written to the had written to an old friend of his. Even though Arlo was a longtime pacifist, he had over the years made friends with the deputy director of selective service. And at the time, selective service was in charge of determining what applicants for discharge from the military by reason of conscientious objection were COs or not. So Arlo had written to this guy and said, I see the regulations have changed. Can Mike Wittels, who has been a volunteer here, reapply? So through a series of letters and events, I was allowed to reapply for discharge. But Captain Minton kept me from knowing about that. And I'll skip the details, except to say, one morning, Sergeant Odding, the one that said he would break me, showed up at my solitary cell and said, your new company commander wants you to write up why you should be discharged. You have an hour. So that turned out to be my second application, even though it wasn't done properly or on the proper forms. But I didn't know any of this. Anyway, Mr. Post said he had contacted Colonel Omer, the deputy director of selective service, and it looked like my application, my second application, was being processed. So Post said, look, I've made a deal with the holding company that you be released there to serve out the rest of your active duty for training, retraining time. And they've promised not to give you any combat duties and you won't have much to do. And it looks like your discharge application will be dealt with within a week or so. And I can't promise it, but it sounded like it might be approved. So I did that, very minimal duties, learned a lot of interesting things, wrote to everybody who had written me in the stockade. I had several, I've been able to smuggle out the names of several, I'd gotten about 400 holiday cards from all around the world, some of them from well-known people such as Stoughton Lynn, and anyway, Steve Allen, the old host of The Tonight Show. Anyway, so I wrote to people, and including the mom of another prisoner. But it dragged on, and then finally, one morning, a Jeep driven by a sergeant came around to collect me and took me to these buildings to sign various forms, and then took me to the bus station. I had no discharge, no leave papers, nothing, no papers. And I remember from my training days that on the bus into town to Louisville, MPs would get on board to check your papers. And I had nothing. And I thought, here I go, all over again. But I got to the plane, got on the plane, got to Barbara's apartment all without incident. And then at that point, a couple of days later, I went to go see Arlo and the staff there and thank them. And Arlo asked if I would like to see my file, and I did. It was full of all this information I just told you. And Arlo said he had no idea what would happen. This was March, but I was eligible to be called back to active duty. I was eligible to be arrested any minute as AWOL. I was eligible to be drafted for someone who didn't fulfill my reserve obligations. And sometime in June, I think I gave you the date, my mother called me up and said, you have something here from the Army. And I said, open it, please. And could you read it to me? It was orders. The following people are discharged for the following reasons. So she reads the first one, discharged to accept a commission in the U.S. Army Reserve. I said, well, read the next one. And I thought, they've screwed up again. Now I'm an officer. And she finally got to the last. I said, look for my name, and discharge for reason of conscientious objection. So it's a general discharge under honorable conditions, which I didn't care about that, but I thought that because of my age and because I wasn't officially completed, I was still eligible for the draft. But I forgot what my age was. I mean, I just, you get to a certain point anyway, but because of age, I was no longer eligible. So that was the end of that.
So, Mike, I have a few follow-up questions at this point, but I'll try to keep it limited. The atmosphere that you described sounds like a lot of uncertainty. Like there's a lot of fear of the unknown. You don't know what's going to happen next. But I guess I'm curious, what were your plans for after you got the discharge? What was the ultimate goal for you? Was it just to get out of the military? Did you have plans beyond that? Some part of that larger organization that you mentioned, like Stoughton Lynn?
I had been trained as an artist. I started out as an engineering student, but switched to art. And I had been working on my art before I got into the Army, and that was my plan, to go back and do the art. I had various ways of, various odd jobs. I'd done all kinds of things, from teaching to manual labor to so on. So that was what I was going to do. I had no other career goals.
What about like your political goals? I mean, I know you said you weren't necessarily political, but did you have plans to engage in this larger network of other people trying to seek conscientious objection?
No, I didn't. I had volunteered at the CCCO, which is called the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors. Later, they changed their name to reflect their broader concerns. But I volunteered. I did, office work and so on. And one day I was walking on the street and I met their administrative assistant who I knew, and he said, "Hey, Mike, could you come into the office for 3 days and straighten out the files?" And I said, "Sure," and they were going to pay me something. And while I was there, I saw how crazy busy they were. The phones were ringing, people were coming in, and they were looking for a new counselor. And some of the people there recommended me, and I finally agreed, okay, but only part-time and only until you find somebody else. But I tend to indulge in what I'm doing, and I worked more than part-time, and I kept working. And I was thinking of the guys I was locked up with. And I thought, these guys like them, need help. So I kept working for them day and night. I even got a call at home from an Air Force pilot who was using his Red Cross Thanksgiving call to call me about his change of heart. He had become a CO while flying missions in Vietnam. But anyway, I started out counseling person to person, draft and military. In fact, I didn't plan to specialize in military, but the woman who answered the phone, if somebody called up who was in the military, she was very formal, and she said, "Let me transfer you to our military specialist, Mike Wittels." And so by necessity, I got to learn a lot about military law in that area. And I would get calls from lawyers. I was like the distant expert. I mean, I wasn't, but that was the idea. So a lawyer would call up with a question. I said, "Well, I'll call you back," and I'd go look it up in the books and regulations. So I became, by default, a go-to guy. And after, I had an unsought career until the end of the Vietnam War. Along the way, I was asked to be, by the American Veterans Committee, to be on their initial planning committee. And I was a kid with no college degree. I mean, I was like 27 by then, and here a retired federal judge, the chief sociologist of the Army, who was in the uniform. There's about 20 guys. By the way, that sociologist gave a talk about welfare. This is 50 some years ago. And even back then, GIs who had kids weren't getting paid enough. But he kept looking at me, and I had, why is he looking at me? Later, we had the national conference with 600 people, and including him. At that point, I was on the panel about conscientious objection. The 600 people included the head of the Canadian Armed Forces, whom I had lunch with, the person from the State Department, the head of the International Red Cross, and on like that. I was on a panel with the head of the ACLU and the deputy director of selective service. And he was the first speaker, and he said something I quoted him on later, which was, "We were all conscientious objectors." There is a point at which we will not do something, but the law only recognizes those opposed to participation in all wars. So he was a reasonable guy, and I wasn't trying to influence people. I was providing information. By the way, I used that quote from Colonel Omer when, for some really odd reason, I was invited to talk to the just graduated class of Air Force officers at Fort Lackland Air Force Base. And the chaplain there had arranged it. And he was also the coach of the baseball team. And he was a coach type. And I went in, I was groggy in the morning. I'd done these tours, television, radio, just something I never planned to do, and had been an introvert, but I got all this practice anyway. So I was tired from this other stuff. And the chaplain coach said, "Mike, I see these guys come in here, and when they come in, they're thinking, and they're here for a while, and there's a cloud come to. Get out there, Mike, and make them think." So I got out there, and there's all these young officers and senior officers sitting behind them. Now, this was for chapel. This wasn't the graduation ceremony, but they had just graduated. So I was pretty nervous. I thought I'd get some hostility. This would be about 71. So there's already a lot of opposition to the Vietnam War. And I started out with the quote from Colonel Omer. And I said to these young officers, so you got to think about this, because when you're in a plane starting to drop bombs, it's kind of too late. Also, you may have to deal with enlisted people who think they've become COs. And COs can be basketball players, blah, blah, all kinds of people. So one of the first questions was from, this guy who, to me, looked like a hostile type, kind of big build and squat neck. And he said, sir, I'm a civilian, and I made it clear, but sir, I am not a conscientious objector to all war, but I am a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War. What should I do, sir? And this is in front of all his colleagues and the senior officers in the back. So I said, well, come talk to me. Then afterwards, one of the other guys stood up and said, isn't it true this is just cowardice? And some of the other guys said, oh, sit down, something like that. So everybody was sympathetic. It was that point in the war.
You
And
mentioned something a minute ago that I wanted to follow up as
yeah,
well with. You mentioned your mother, and you mentioned getting this discharge. And I'm curious about the stigma attached to conscientious objection, but also the stigma attached to an undesirable discharge. Can you talk about that? Were you aware or fearful of that?
no, I didn't care. I had that artist mentality of, it doesn't matter. I had renounced all benefits from the Army. I didn't care about that. I had refused pay when I first filed for discharge. I accepted the pay that I got while I was locked up, but it was like $40 a month. But as far as, I didn't care what kind of discharge I had. And it never came up.
How did your family feel about
Well,
this?
by that time, as I mentioned, my father was burned out. He had become an alcoholic. They had separated. He he talked to me when I had first decided and said, he had turned from this extremely intelligent, articulate person to a burned out person. He said, well, don't you understand about the communists? Just that usual thing. My mother was kind of, she was bright, but it was, when I went off to the stockade, this will encapsulate it. She said, at least you'll get 3 square meals a day. So that was her attitude. Like, she was all over the map politically. But again, she had been an artist. My father was a writer. They traveled in those crowds. They knew communists in the 30s. So they weren't very straight-laced in their political ideas.
Interesting. And then I guess my other question is, you described this 5-year period in which you were serving as kind of a counselor to other people. And then you mentioned in 1971 that interaction with this group of Air Force officers. This is a point where the VVAW is highly visible. There's that, march on Capitol Hill, and they're rejecting their medals, and the Pentagon Papers had just come out. And I'm curious, were your was your involvement connected to the VVAW, or a larger group of people protesting against the war?
Frankly, I was an emergency nurse, so to speak. I was constantly dealing with people with serious problems. I had people come into the office. I got orders to Vietnam. What should I do? So it was like that all the time. And I did go to a couple of protests, but as I say, I was in the ER, so to speak. I, of course, supported everybody and still do. But personally, um, yeah. Uh, Later, after Philadelphia, where I was working, I got sent out to San Francisco to the West Coast office, which had just been expanded to cover the 13 Western states. And all of this, and I was made the national coordinator of military counseling. So I had responsibilities for seeing the counselors got trained. I went to a lot of conferences of lawyers. I trained lawyers. It's really funny. I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to be a lawyer. But I just happened to learn these particular things. Let me go back to that final, which the first edition sold a total of 40,000 copies. We sold it for $1 or gave it away. We had it distributed every place. But to go back to that American Veterans Committee big meeting, after I got back, the book had just been published. After I got back to the West Coast, I had it sent with a cover letter to every participant. And I got back some thank you letters. And I got one back from that colonel who had been the head sociologist. But this time it was on the letterhead of the University of Alabama, where he was now dean of the School of Social Work. And the letter said, "Thanks for the book. It's well done and sorely needed. If you need, it took me 20 years to learn war is hell. If you need any help on the Southern Front, just let me know." My point with that story is we were getting an awful lot of support from a lot of quarters, surprising places. I even got an invitation in San Francisco to talk to the Chinatown Seroptimist Club. So I wasn't feeling discriminated against at all, at that time. I knew the vets were out there, the Vietnam vets and Veterans for Peace and other groups creating a lot of good trouble. And I supported that. But as I say, I had my hands full with direct stuff.
So I'm curious, what was the process like? Say I walk into your office, Mike, and I'm having reservations about my draft notice, and I'm considering evading or fleeing. What was that process like for you? What advice would you give?
After The most important thing, of course, is the interviewing, finding out what the person's concerns really are. So some people might walk in with saying, well, you know, I'm married and can I still get drafted? But let's say they had decided they were against the Vietnam War. So again, I would, you know, after I would find out if they had any other way of getting discharged. If they had medical problems, you know, again, there were a lot of ways that were virtually all ways were simpler than a CO discharge. And for a good period there, the Army had not, the military had not been granting. That's another story. So if they were bent on, normally I would say, if they felt they wanted to, I would say, well, they should file, and I'd have them do a draft of their answers. The questions were the same as they were for civilians on what was called Form 150, and I'd have them draft their answers and bring them in. I never encouraged somebody to be a CO. I never told them what to say or what to think. In fact, I often, if not always, challenged them. What do you mean by this? I often, especially if they said they were going to refuse orders, I would try to talk them out of it. Because if I could talk them out of it, you know, the Army could talk them out of it. So that was, and after they had their discharge application to a point that satisfied them and was clear enough to me, they would file. They faced a hearing from a hearing officer, later a psychiatrist, and from a chaplain. The hearing officer was supposed to determine whether they qualified in any way, and the chaplain, their sincerity. And again, I didn't coach them, say, oh, here's what you got to say. But it was more, well, what would you say to him? And then I would maybe role play and say, you know, well, that doesn't sound religious, and get the guy to express what he really meant. There were some counselors out there, not in our organization, who tried to coach people, and I just thought that was a terrible idea. Not only being impractical because it would backfire, but frankly, I think the organization was most interested in the integrity of an individual. I even counseled people when I was in the stockade how to fight getting discharged, because they really wanted to stay. Their whole family was in the military and so on. So I actually thought, it's still part of my core belief, that it's important for people to do what they believe in. Does that answer what you're asking?
It does. And I guess I'm kind of struggling to articulate my next question, but I guess I would put it to you like this. What greater meaning did you draw from that experience in your life? Can you talk about maybe how the rewards of that kind of work that you did?
Let me turn this up a second. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Could you talk about the larger meaning that experience and that role played in your life? Was it rewarding work?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. At the time, I didn't have much spare time to feel rewarded. It's like you're always helping, patching up and so on. But I've had people since, write to me and remember me and so on. And again, it was immediately rewarding. I saw so many interesting results. I saw people change. I saw people, not to sound too new age, take charge of their lives. And each person who took charge of his or her, I had a few women counselees, I don't like the term, but I know what, as they took charge of their lives, others were influenced. Real quick, I had two guys come at once. Normally, I want just one, but they were both intelligence officers in training at Fort Knox. And one had wanted to be an FBI agent, but they wouldn't accept him because he hadn't been drafted yet. And the other had dropped out of seminary. They were called Frank and Mike, which later was a radio show, but not with those two guys. So they had in each class been sitting across from each other and got to be pals. And they were put into a program. Have you heard about the Phoenix program? So they were being trained to deal with that. And they got talking and they said, no, we're not going to do this. And they realized that they were COs. So they came from Baltimore to visit me, and this was in Philadelphia. And, we talked about what they needed to do and they filed. But the regulations were, at the time, once you file, you can't be placed on combat duties or training. So they were put in the front office, counting paper clips, as they called it. So other young officers would come in and say, hey, what are you guys doing? And they would tell them. And there got to be at one point at Fort Knox, when those, right in that time frame, and this must have been no later than mid-70s, there were 20 applicants for COs among the intelligence officers. But yeah, it was rewarding because I saw people I helped get their lives cleaner. Also, when people learn about their rights in any area, they're stronger in dealing with, politically, they're stronger. But by the way, I worked with a lot of lawyers. I've got to know good guy lawyers. And the lawyers learned a lot of stuff. And I learned, for instance, virtually every draft notice was, illegal isn't the right word, didn't meet the legal requirements, simply because in most cases, the draft board clerks were making the decisions, and under law, they weren't empowered to. And I won't go on with that, but I learned, and other people learned, that, wait a minute, just because they tell you this is the rule doesn't mean it actually is the rule. Most of the Army regulations about most of the things weren't regulations. I mean, I know I got a whole set of regulations for a whole lot of things. So yes, quite rewarding.
I'm curious, Mike, how this era in your life, from the military to the work you did in the office, how did it affect the rest of your life?
Um, I'm trying to think of the negative stuff, and there's not much. I might be a little more cautious, which isn't necessarily negative. I learned probably, the odds are, this is me talking to myself, I can get through this. I got through a bunch of junk and I got through it. I want to tell you, I think this will illustrate something. The short version is, again, you don't know in the beginning what's going to happen. There's a line in Joseph Heller's We Bombed Over New Haven where one character says, things don't end up like they start. And the other one says, oh, that's really pessimistic. He says, no, maybe the first character says, as a plan. No, I'm not being pessimistic. That's just how it is. So I learned that. I learned don't jump to conclusions. Hold off as long as you can. I mean, if there's a fire, you got to move. But and here's what I wanted to tell you, this true story. You remember the the sergeant who, in the beginning, where they surrounded me and pushed me around, and the sergeant says, "You should be put to death if I think he said 2 kids or 3 kids, and one of them grows up to be a CO, I'll kill him." So I immediately wrote him off. Who wouldn't? When I got put in the group cell, I found every morning there was inspection, like in the Army, and we had to line up our boots. We each had 2 pair of boots down the center of the aisle, and the inspecting sergeant would come in and look at them and kick the ones and yell at you if your boots weren't properly shined. I wasn't good at shining boots. I tried, but I just wasn't good at it. And about 2 or 3 weeks into that, the other guy said, uh-oh, Koenig is the inspector today, and he's a real son of a bitch. So I knew my boots would be kicked and I'd be yelled at. He comes in, I'm about in the halfway down the road. He kicks a few boots, tells people they're idiots and scum of the earth and so on because they don't have their boot shined. He gets to mine and he just touches them with the toe of his boot. And he says, try to do a little better. What the hell? This is, and then I didn't see him. He wasn't somebody I'd seen, in between. And I got put in that second solitary. And each day it was a different sergeant taking roll. So one day it was him, followed by some privates, comes by my cell, yells out my name. I say, here. He goes down past the next cell, which was a group cell, and around the corner. And that was that. I can't hear anything, but he comes back and he says, Wittels, how are you doing? Like that, casually. I said, fine, Sarge, how about you? He says, okay. He said, the day you came in here, I was ready to kill you. If you had just so much as balled your fist, I would have had a reason. I said, oh, well. And he said, okay, but look, I went home And I talked to my wife, and she's German, and she's redhead too. And we decided you weren't crazy and you weren't an idiot. If you had your way, I'd be out of a job. But I admire you for sticking to your beliefs. Good luck. And he walked off. I later figured he must have been behind that command desk when I was talking to those young guards about my beliefs and doing it, like a regular guy, like rather you're going to hell, and and I later found out that was his last day in the stockade. So you can see the impact that had on the rest of my life, not to judge until you have a really good reason to judge. And even then, and again, in the counseling, I dealt with lifers who had become COs. I dealt with officers, lifer officers. So even though someone's at point A here in their life, they may be at point B later. We're seeing it now with the staunch Republicans who are saying, well, Trump isn't such a good guy after all. Some of them are flipping to being independents or Democrats. So that's the big lesson. Stuff changes.
So, Mike, today there's kind of a militarism in American society. And it's hard sometimes, I think, for students who have come of age in this era to understand what it was like during the Vietnam War period and why so many people objected and protested against that. I guess my question is, what would you tell my students about Gabrielle, for example, about what that was like in that moment to stand up against the war in Vietnam and militarism in general?
Well, it was hard, as I say, and I know it sounds dramatic. I thought I might die. But all these guys who go off to battle have to have that same kind of thought. They also have to think, I'm not going to die, otherwise you don't do it. But there's a reason the military or the establishment, the military industrial complex, and remember, it was a General Eisenhower who said that. He said, I hate war, as I've seen it, I hate it. So the military industrial complex goes after you young people because it knows you don't have enough world experience to be a General Eisenhower, to be a General Shoup, the former commander of the Marines who turned against the Vietnam War, to be a General Smedley Butler who turned against foreign wars. And they each said, look, Smedley Butler said, I forget the word he used, but I was a gangster for Standard Oil. I'm going to tell you one personal thing. I worked as a carpenter, freelance carpenter stuff. I worked for this family in a fancy neighborhood. The dad was this is 30 years ago, at least. The dad was the manager of strategic planning for, I'll just say, one of the big three oil companies. I was there a long time. By the way, I got called up there by a contractor I know to do a tiny job. Talk about how things become something else. I was up there for 6 months. I got to know the family very well. One time the older teenage son said to me, I really love Jack. That's what he called his dad. But his job is to plan the next war. You know how you pick up things at dinner from your parents that they don't expect you to hear? So a lot of people, including many I mentioned, think it's not really about protecting democracy and freedom, that it's really about other things. So to you young students, I would say, cast a very critical and cynical eye on these claims. They might be right, these claims about protecting freedom and democracy might be right, but why do so many veterans and longtime soldiers and sailors and Marines say, wait a minute, I was wrong to do this. It's not a good idea.
Thank you for that, Mike. At this point, Gabrielle, I'd like to open the opportunity for you to ask any questions. I know that you've gone very carefully through the previous interview, and I'm sure that you've sat here quietly during this part, thinking of questions and things that you want to learn more about. Do you have any questions for Mike?
I do have one question. Did you ever reconnect with anyone you knew from the Army Reserves or someone you met in the stockade?
Yeah, often. Both by letter and in person. I had one of those ex-intelligence officers come and by a few years ago and invite me up to, he was now had a farm. And yeah, lots of things. Oh, I'll keep this short, but in one of my many outer imposed phases in the stockade, when I was put in the training room, the assistant training sergeant became a pal. He wasn't sympathetic. I don't know his views on the war, but we kept up a correspondence afterwards. And two paintings which I had done, which I couldn't get smuggled out, they were too large, he mailed to me later. He, at some peril to himself. And we kept in correspondence for a while. So yeah, there were other people. And did you have a more specific idea of that, or just in general?
It was just in general, like, because if you knew anybody that was kind of against your opinions, like, I want to know if you wanted to reconnect with those people, if you just turned away from them because they didn't see the same thing as you.
No, I didn't turn away from anybody. Real quick, no, I accept people for what they are at the time and have no further expectations other than the normal, day-to-day one. I live in a converted Army place. It's not very Army. But several years ago, so a guy showed up in fatigues as a lieutenant, an older guy, older than me, and I was about 41 when I came here. And he turned out to be an active duty colonel who was just getting out of the Army because it was time. His wife had divorced him because of the Vietnam War. She had become against it, and he wasn't. He got to know me little by little. He came in my studio, and I had some things hanging up, and some of them were hand carved in a way that he thought showed some skill. And he had come here while in the Army, and I'll tell you his assignment in the Army, he had started making replicas of Renaissance instruments. And he had come here to set up a workshop to do that in his return. And so little by little, we got to know each other. And he was in the Army, he was a career intelligence officer. And the last 10 years of his life, of his career rather, he spent as the military attaché to the German embassy. But he lived here and I lived here at the time we were allowed to live here, and he had a place fixed up as an apartment, which one of the owners had done. And he'd invite me over. He was lonely, and he'd cook, and we'd drink. I was, and talk about stuff. And I told him, look, I used the word premature conscientious objector. And he said, well, I respect that. He still believed in the Vietnam War. It looked like he couldn't make a living making his instruments, although they were excellent. There just weren't enough customers. So he went looking for a job in his specialty, counterintelligence. One day, I'm in my studio, a youngish guy shows up, flashes a very fancy badge, and says he's DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and said, do you know this person? I'll skip his name for now. And I said, yes. And he asked me a series of questions, like, do you think he's a loyal citizen? Stuff like that. When John came back from where he was, I joked to him I said, oh yeah, he buys me booze and at discount rates. But John had given me as a character reference for him to get a job which he now has in the defense industry. So we were friends. We respected each other. I'm sure he thought I was wrong, and I certainly thought he was wrong. But there's so many things to a person that I can't discount somebody unless they're cruel. And that's probably a good way to be. Oh my God, he's a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. That's just one little thing.
So, Mike, I'd like to get a better sense of what you did after the war. Can you give me the highlights of your life beyond the Vietnam War period? Like, were you an artist for the most of those years?
I've been an artist, but like 99% of the artists have to do other things to have an income. So I did a lot of carpentry work. I self-taught, learned on the job. I learned mainly by saying yes when somebody said, could you do such and such job for me? And I didn't mean, oh yeah, I know how to do that, but yeah, I'll do the job for you. I hate to turn people down. So I did a lot of that. I have a daughter who's 41. My mother never married just because my parents' marriage wasn't very good. And I guess that was my pattern. And I thought being married means, although I was married once to someone else, anyway, I had hangups there, I guess. So my daughter and I get along just fine. She calls me once a week. We talk for 2 hours about what we're doing and everything in the world. We're both science people. She has her degree in that. I started out thinking about science stuff. She's an art person. Her degree is in microbiology, molecular biology, but she decided she didn't want to continue with that. She looked all around and then she said, I'm interested, I like art and I like fixing things, which is sort of like me. And so she became a conservator and she works for the Huntington now. So that's a highlight to have a friend like that. And her mother, we talk twice a week against stuff. She's a super peacenik, very kind, very gentle person. She was on the Guantanamo to Quebec peace walk in 1962, and she still knows. She knew, I don't know if you know these names, A.J. Musty and Dave Dellinger, and all those big names in the peace movement. So she's I was a neophyte, I wasn't in the movement. I was just some guy who thought, well, this isn't a good idea.
Do you have grandchildren as well?
No, I don't have grandchildren. My daughter, I guess she's a lesbian. She's out. We're comfortable with that. She has a wife. They're in the process of being foster parents. I've had several shows as an artist, solo shows, and I just had an open studio where a fellow artist who I didn't know wanted to buy something, and I finally turned her down because that particular piece. Anyway, that's just on and on. So art things, positive art things have happened.
What kind of greater legacy would you like to leave behind?
Legacy? I think I'll quote my, I guess, common law wife, be nice to people.
Simple but profound. I like it.
Yeah.
Well, my last question is there anything throughout the interviews that you wanted to talk about that I haven't thought to ask, or something that you forgot, or anything that you wanted to go back to?
No, I understand that my case is significantly different from other cases. And so those details that have been left out don't impact what you're trying to present. I have a great admiration for anyone who has stood up for what they believe. And I think it would be a better world. Well, this is all editorializing. If people did that, whatever. When I worked for Triple CO, once in a while we get a call from somebody who wanted to know how to get into the reserves. And some of my colleagues said, oh, we shouldn't talk to them. And I said, no, based on my philosophy. But also, why are they calling here? Perhaps they don't really want that. But anyway, no, I think you've covered. I think this is a great thing you're doing, especially for you young people like Gabrielle, who don't know what the world is really like yet. Yeah, you only know what it's really like in retrospect.
In retrospect, I'd like to thank you for sharing your story with me, Mike. I have great admiration for people who firmly stand up for their beliefs. I think that takes a real moral courage. you suggested that it's an exaggeration that you were risking your life, but I do think that not knowing the consequences of standing up for those beliefs and doing it anyway,
Well,
even though that you might not have ever gone to Vietnam, it took a real moral courage, and I respect that.
well, thank you. I mean, that's my message. Don't worry about, anyway, I can't articulate any more. Thanks so much, Jason and Gabriel, for doing this. And I'll keep my eye on you people.
Well, thank you. And if there's something beyond the interview today and you want to reach back out, feel free
Oh,
to email me or contact me.
I do. Jason, as I mentioned before, I've done a memoir and I've put parts, I have a lot of images, documents, and lists of things, and I did a bunch of text boxes. I'm fairly big on accurate information, so I have those on the site, which is not publicly viewable. But if you need and to look at any of that, we can work that out.
That would be great. And I was astounded by the art that you sent in the email. So I would love to see more of that if you'd be willing to share some of it.
Okay. You know, I would do these drawings, pretend I was writing a letter, because you were allowed to write letters. Or sometimes in solitary, I would do them on matchbook. Anyway, but the ones, I'm going to say something every artist says, those are not my best work. My best work I gave away, but those were drawings done in the stockade of other guys. Anyway, if you need to, let me know about looking at various documents and from Army people and the psychiatrist write-up of me and so on. So
Yeah, that would be fantastic, Mike. I'll reach back out with those further questions as they come up. And I'd definitely be interested in seeing some more of your artwork. I think that would be
okay,
fantastic.
my present artwork is as abstract. I'll give you a link to my site, my current site. And Gabriel, thanks for being in on all of this.
Thank you for letting me watch this interview.
Okay. Take care.
All right, Mike, have a great day.
You too.